Maria Alves, a respected judge at the International Court of Justice, stepped off the plane, her heels clicking softly against the smooth floor of the bustling airport. It had been a long flight, the kind that leaves a person drained, but she had no time to relax. She had a job to do. She was here to deliver a keynote speech at a high-profile human rights conference, a topic she was deeply passionate about. With her passport and diplomatic credentials in hand, Maria made her way through the crowd toward the immigration line. It was a typical scene. Tired travelers standing in lines, uniformed officers scanning passports, and the low hum of conversations mixing with the overhead announcements. Maria had done this many times before, and it should have been routine. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake off the exhaustion. When her turn came, she walked confidently up to the immigration counter. 2 officers were stationed there, one tall and broad, with a hard expression, the other smaller with a smirk playing on his lips. Their name tags read Officer Bradford and Officer Miller. "Passport and purpose of visit?" Bradford asked, his voice sharp and lacking any warmth. He barely glanced at her before shifting his focus to the computer in front of him. Maria handed over her documents. "I'm here for a conference. I'm a judge with the International Court of Justice." She spoke with the calm, steady tone of someone used to authority. Bradford took the passport from her hand, but paused as his eyes scanned the details. He gave her another look, this time more scrutinizing. Miller, who had been watching quietly, leaned in to see what his partner was reading. There was a brief exchange of glances between them that Maria didn't like. She'd seen that look before, the kind of look that said, "Something's not adding up." Bradford tapped the passport against his palm, his eyes narrowing. "International Court of Justice, huh?" he muttered, his tone thick with doubt. He flipped through the pages of her passport slowly, as if waiting to catch something suspicious. Miller snorted softly. "Looks fishy to me," he said, just loud enough for Maria to hear. Her stomach tightened. She kept her face neutral, though. "It's valid. You can check it in your system," she said, maintaining her composure. But deep down, she felt the familiar chill of injustice settling over her. She had learned long ago that patience was necessary in these situations, but it never got any easier. Bradford turned to his partner. "We should take her for additional screening." Maria blinked, taken aback by the sudden escalation. "There's no need for that," she said firmly, but her words were ignored. The next thing she knew, she was being escorted away from the immigration line, eyes following her as she walked between the 2 officers. She could feel the stares of other travelers, their curiosity piercing through her already fraying composure. She kept her head high, refusing to let them see her discomfort. The small room they led her to was sterile, brightly lit with harsh fluorescent lights. It was the kind of room meant to make people feel small. Maria felt a familiar wave of indignation rising inside her, but she suppressed it. "Stay calm," she told herself. "This will pass." Bradford and Miller stood by the door, arms crossed, watching her with the same air of suspicion. A 3rd officer, someone younger and less hostile, began going through her belongings. The pat-down was invasive, the search through her luggage unnecessary. Her personal items were spread across the table like they meant nothing. Her carefully prepared notes for the conference, her personal effects, all tossed around as though she were a criminal. Bradford picked up one of her folders and leafed through it with an exaggerated air of disinterest. "This doesn't look like anything important," he muttered, holding up her conference materials. What kind of judge travels alone, anyway? Maria clenched her teeth, but stayed silent. She had been through situations like this before, too many to count. Each time, it was a fresh wound, but she had learned how to maintain her dignity. She wasn't going to let them see how much this bothered her. Miller, meanwhile, rummaged through her suitcase, shaking his head as if disappointed not to find something incriminating. "That's what they all say," he said, barely glancing in her direction. Her patience was wearing thin. She could feel the tension in her body, her muscles tight with frustration. No matter what she said, it was clear that these men had already decided who she was. To them, she was just another black woman they could intimidate, another face in the crowd, despite the title she carried. "All right," Bradford finally said, tossing her passport back on the table as though it were worthless. "We're going to need more time to verify this. Sit tight." Maria looked at him, her jaw set. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She had been through worse than this and come out stronger. But as she sat down in the cold metal chair they provided, the feeling of being singled out, humiliated, and degraded weighed heavily on her. She had a role to play at that conference, a voice to raise for the voiceless. But right now, she was just another target in their game of prejudice. The sterile, cold room was suffocating, the weight of the situation pressing down on Maria as she sat, hands resting on her lap, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't about protocol anymore. The arrogance in the way Bradford and Miller handled her spoke volumes. This was about something else, something uglier. Bradford paced the room slowly, his heavy boots echoing against the floor. He stopped, standing tall in front of Maria, his expression hard. "You know, people like you always think they're untouchable," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, waving around some fancy title, like it means something here. Maria held his gaze, her body tense, but her face calm. She had no intention of engaging with him. She knew his type too well. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to slip, to lash out, so he could justify his actions. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Seeing no response, Bradford smirked and turned to Miller, who had been rummaging through her belongings with exaggerated carelessness. Miller glanced up, chuckling under his breath, as though they were sharing some unspoken joke. "We should teach her a lesson," Miller muttered, tossing one of her notebooks onto the table with a careless flick of his wrist. "Show her what happens when people think they're better than the law." Maria's pulse quickened, her breath tightening in her chest. She had always known that racism was deeply rooted in systems of power, but the level of hatred in their voices was unsettling. This wasn't just about her being a judge or a diplomat. This was about her skin color. Her very existence was a challenge to their narrow worldview. Without warning, Bradford grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly out of the chair. "Let's see what else you're hiding," he said, his grip firm and bruising. Maria gasped but didn't struggle. She knew better than to fight. Resistance would only make things worse. He shoved her against the cold, hard wall, his hand pressing her shoulder as he ordered her to stay still. Miller stepped forward, a cruel smile tugging at his lips as he began another invasive pat-down, his hands lingering in places that made her skin crawl. The violation felt unbearable, but Maria bit her lip, forcing herself to remain silent. She wouldn't give them what they wanted. "Nothing," Miller grunted after a moment, clearly disappointed. "Just like I thought." Bradford didn't release her immediately. He held her there for another second, his hand tightening on her arm, as though he were daring her to react. Finally, he let go, and Maria staggered slightly, catching herself on the edge of the table. Her body ached, but the deeper pain was the indignity of it all. She stood there for a moment, breathing slowly to calm herself. She couldn't let them see how much this was affecting her, though every fiber of her being wanted to scream at the injustice. Instead, she straightened her posture and looked directly at Bradford, who was watching her with a look of smug satisfaction. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Bradford raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, yeah? And what mistake is that? Maria didn't respond. There was no point in arguing with men like him. They weren't interested in reason or truth. They had already made up their minds about who she was, and nothing she said would change that. But as she stood there, battered but unbroken, she knew something they didn't. The truth was on her side, and it was only a matter of time before their arrogance would come crashing down. For now, though, she had to endure. Bradford exchanged another glance with Miller, then shook his head. "This one thing she's special," he muttered, moving toward the door. "We'll see how special she feels once she spent a few hours in a holding cell." Miller snickered as he gathered up her things, stuffing them haphazardly back into her bag. "Yeah, maybe she'll learn a little humility." They moved toward the door, leaving Maria standing alone in the middle of the room. Her muscles ached from the rough treatment, but it was the bruising on her spirit that hurt the most. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced injustice because of the color of their skin, every person who had been treated as less than human. As the door clicked shut behind them, Maria allowed herself to exhale, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. Her body trembled slightly from the adrenaline, but she steadied herself, refusing to be broken by their hatred. She had come too far to be beaten down now. She glanced at the clock on the wall. She had no idea how long they planned to keep her here, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. Her time would come. She just had to wait for the right moment. For now, all she could do was hold on to the strength that had carried her through so many battles before. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and soon they would find out. The hours dragged by in the cold, dimly lit holding cell. Maria sat on the hard bench, her mind racing despite her best efforts to calm herself. The indignity of the situation weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let it break her. She thought of her family, her colleagues, and the thousands of people who would be attending the conference, waiting to hear her speak. They had no idea where she was. Maria's phone had been taken during the search, and she hadn't been allowed to make any calls. No one knew she was being held in an airport detention room, treated like a criminal. She wondered if her absence had been noticed yet, if anyone had started looking for her. The conference organizers were probably scrambling by now, worried about the keynote speaker who had mysteriously vanished. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the anxiety that was slowly creeping in. She had to believe that this would be resolved soon, that someone would figure out what was happening. But as the minutes ticked by, doubt began to gnaw at her. What if no one came? What if they left her here forgotten? The door to the cell suddenly swung open with a loud creak, and Officer Miller stepped inside, a smirk on his face. "Enjoying your stay?" he asked, his voice full of mockery. Maria didn't respond. She knew better than to engage. Any response would only feed into his need for control. Instead, she stared straight ahead, ignoring his presence. Miller's smirk faltered slightly at her silence, but he recovered quickly. "We'll be keeping you here a while longer," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Gotta make sure everything checks out, you know. Can't be too careful these days." Maria stayed quiet, her gaze steady. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her frustration. Miller glanced at his watch, then sighed dramatically. "Shame, really," he said, turning toward the door. "A woman like you should know her place." The words hit Maria harder than she expected, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she watched as he left, the door slamming shut behind him. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time she had encountered blatant racism, but it didn't make it any easier. She had worked her entire life to rise above the stereotypes and limitations placed on her because of her race and gender. She had proven herself time and again, yet here she was, once again reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin in the eyes of these men. But they didn't know who she was. Not really. As the hours passed, Maria's thoughts began to shift. She wasn't just a victim in this situation. She was a judge, a voice for justice. She had spent years fighting for the rights of others, and now it was her turn to fight for herself. She knew that once the truth came out, once her identity was fully known, everything would change. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her concentration. The door opened again, this time with more force, and Bradford entered the room, followed by a senior officer, a man Maria hadn't seen before. He was older, with gray hair and a calm demeanor, his uniform crisp and spotless. Bradford's earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced with a tense, rigid posture. The senior officer, whose badge read Captain Wilkins, approached Maria, his expression serious. "Ms. Alves," he began, his tone formal. "I'm Captain Wilkins. We've come across some information that changes the situation." Maria raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. She wasn't going to make this easy for them. Wilkins cleared his throat. "We've verified your credentials. You are, indeed, the Judge Maria Alves from the International Court of Justice." He paused, glancing at Bradford, who stood stiffly beside him, his face pale. "I want to personally apologize for the way you've been treated here." Maria remained silent for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. The apology felt hollow, but she understood the significance of it. This was the moment they realized their mistake. She finally spoke, her voice steady and calm. "Why was I treated this way in the first place?" Captain Wilkins looked uncomfortable. "There was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Maria repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I presented my diplomatic credentials. That should have been enough. But instead, I was treated like a criminal." Bradford shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the floor. The arrogance from earlier had vanished completely. He couldn't even look at her. Wilkins sighed. "I understand that, and I assure you, we're conducting an internal review to ensure this doesn't happen again." Maria stood slowly, her body still aching from the rough treatment. She faced Wilkins, her expression calm but unyielding. "An internal review isn't enough. What happened here today was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a violation of my rights." Wilkins nodded, clearly unsure of what to say. "We'll make this right," he said quietly. "We'll make sure those responsible are held accountable." Maria held his gaze for a moment longer before turning her attention to Bradford. "You treated me like I was less than human," she said, her voice low but firm. "And now, you can't even look me in the eye." Bradford's face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. Wilkins cleared his throat again. "Ms. Alves, we've arranged for your immediate release. Your belongings will be returned, and we'll provide transportation to your hotel." Maria nodded curtly. "I expect a formal apology from this department," she said, her voice unwavering. "In writing, you'll have it," Wilkins promised. Without another word, Maria walked past them, her head held high. She had been humiliated, degraded, but she hadn't been broken. As she stepped out of the detention room and into the corridor, she knew that this experience would not define her. She had fought her whole life to rise above the hatred and prejudice of others, and she wasn't about to stop now. Maria stepped out of the airport into the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the last few hours lift slightly from her shoulders. The car provided by the airport authorities was waiting for her at the curb, a sleek, black vehicle with a driver standing ready. The man held the door open as she approached, but Maria paused for a moment before getting in, letting herself take in the moment of calm. After the humiliation she had just endured, it felt good to breathe freely again. But she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ride to the hotel was quiet, the city lights blurring past the window as Maria rested her head against the seat. Her mind raced with thoughts of the day ahead. The conference, the keynote speech, and the fact that she had to find a way to refocus despite everything that had happened. She had to be strong. People were counting on her. As the car pulled up in front of the Grand Hotel where she was staying, the driver stepped out and opened the door for her. Maria thanked him quietly and made her way inside. The hotel lobby was elegant, with polished marble floors and soft lighting, a stark contrast to the harsh environment she had just come from. As she approached the front desk, the receptionist greeted her warmly, completely unaware of the ordeal she had just experienced. "Good evening, Ms. Alves," the receptionist said with a professional smile. "Your room is ready for you." Maria nodded, accepting the key card. "Thank you." As she walked toward the elevator, her phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out and saw a flurry of missed calls and messages from colleagues, the conference organizers, and even some reporters. The news of her disappearance had spread quickly, it seemed. Word was already getting out that something had gone wrong. Maria sighed, feeling the weight of it all return. She wasn't looking forward to the inevitable conversations, but she knew they were necessary. She stepped into the elevator, her thoughts swirling as she rode up to her room. Once inside, she dropped her bag on the bed and sat down, her body feeling heavy with exhaustion. But before she could even take a moment to breathe, her phone rang again. This time, it was her close friend and colleague, Professor David Thompson, one of the main organizers of the conference. "Maria, where have you been? We've been worried sick." David's voice came through the line, filled with concern. Maria closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "I'm fine, David. I had a situation at the airport." "A situation? What happened?" Maria hesitated, unsure how much she wanted to reveal just yet. But David was one of her closest friends. He deserved to know the truth. "I was detained by airport security," she said slowly. "They thought I was a threat. It was because of my race, David. They treated me like a criminal." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when David finally spoke, his voice was tight with anger. "That's outrageous. We need to do something about this, Maria. We can't let them get away with treating you like that." "I'm already handling it," she replied calmly. "I've demanded a formal apology from the airport, and I'm planning to file a complaint with the authorities. But right now, I need to focus on the conference. I can't let this distract me." David sighed. "You're right, but this is bigger than just you, Maria. This is about the systemic racism that so many people face every day. You have a platform. You need to speak out about this." Maria knew he was right. As much as she wanted to move past the ordeal and focus on her work, she couldn't ignore the broader implications of what had happened. She had a responsibility to use her voice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced. "I know," she said quietly, "and I will. But first, I need to get through tomorrow." "Of course," David said softly. "We'll talk more after the keynote. Just know that I'm here for you, whatever you need." "Thank you, David. I appreciate it." After hanging up, Maria sat in silence for a moment, staring out at the city skyline. The weight of what had happened at the airport was still heavy on her heart. But now, it was mixed with something else, a sense of purpose. She knew that David was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about the larger fight for justice and equality. And as much as she wanted to focus solely on her work, she couldn't ignore the opportunity to make a difference. With renewed determination, Maria stood up and began preparing for the day ahead. The keynote speech was important, but now it felt even more significant. She wasn't just speaking as a judge or a legal scholar. She was speaking as someone who had experienced firsthand the kind of prejudice she had spent her life fighting against. The next morning, Maria stood backstage at the conference hall, waiting for her introduction. The room was packed, with hundreds of attendees from around the world, all gathered to hear her speak. Her heart raced with a mixture of nerves and excitement, but she reminded herself of the reason she was there. As the announcer's voice echoed through the hall, introducing her as the keynote speaker, Maria took a deep breath and stepped out onto the stage. The lights were bright, and the applause was thunderous, but all she could focus on was a message she needed to deliver. She approached the podium, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. For a moment, she scanned the room, taking in the sea of faces looking back at her. Then, with calm resolve, she began to speak. Maria stood at the podium, feeling the weight of the crowd's attention settle on her. The room was completely silent, waiting for her to speak. Normally, she would dive right into her prepared remarks, focusing on the topic of international law, justice, and diplomacy. But today, after everything she had gone through, her speech took on a deeper, more personal meaning. She adjusted the microphone, her voice steady as she began. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying confidently across the room. "It's an honor to be here today, speaking to so many incredible minds dedicated to justice. But before I begin my formal remarks, I'd like to share something personal." The room remained still, the audience hanging on her every word. Maria took a deep breath and continued. "Yesterday, I was detained at the airport," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Not because I had broken any laws or posed a threat, but because of the color of my skin. Despite presenting my credentials as a judge, I was treated like a criminal, subjected to searches, and denied basic respect." A ripple of shock passed through the audience. Maria saw people shifting in their seats, murmuring quietly to one another. She pressed on, her voice unwavering. "Racism is not just a relic of the past," she said. "It is alive and well, embedded in systems of power, in institutions meant to protect us. As a Black woman in a position of authority, I have spent my life working to break down these barriers, to challenge the injustices that so many of us face. But yesterday was a reminder that no matter how far we've come, there is still so much work to be done." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was silent once more, the weight of her story pressing down on the audience. "I tell you this not to seek sympathy," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "but to remind us all that the fight for justice is ongoing. It is not enough to stand on the sidelines. We must confront these issues head-on, in our courts, in our communities, and in our hearts." Maria saw faces in the crowd nodding in agreement, a collective understanding building. She felt the shift in the room, the empathy, the outrage, the desire for change. "For years, I've spoken about justice on the global stage," she said. "But today, I want to talk about justice closer to home, the kind that affects people every day. People who are judged not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin. People who are treated as less than simply because of their race." She gripped the sides of the podium, her voice rising with conviction. "We cannot call ourselves defenders of justice if we turn a blind eye to these everyday injustices. We cannot build a better world if we allow these systems of oppression to persist. We must hold ourselves accountable, and we must demand accountability from those in power." The audience was completely captivated, their eyes fixed on Maria. She could feel their energy, their support, and it fueled her as she spoke. "I stand before you today not just as a judge, but as a Black woman who has experienced the very prejudice I work to dismantle. And I know I am not alone. We are all part of this struggle, whether we realize it or not." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she continued, transitioning seamlessly into the rest of her speech. She spoke of the challenges facing the international justice system, the importance of diplomacy and cooperation, but the underlying theme of racial justice threaded through every point she made. She used her personal experience as a lens to illuminate the larger issues at play, connecting her audience to the cause in a way that statistics and policy discussions alone never could. By the time she finished, the room was on its feet, the applause thunderous and heartfelt. Maria stepped back from the podium, her heart racing, but not from nerves. It was a rush of knowing she had spoken truth to power, of knowing she had used her platform to make a difference. As she walked off the stage, she was immediately greeted by David, who had been watching from the wings. His face was lit up with pride. "That was incredible, Maria," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You had them in the palm of your hand." Maria smiled, but there was a weariness behind her eyes. "I had to say something," she replied quietly. "I couldn't let what happened yesterday go unspoken." David nodded, understanding. "And you didn't. You turned it into something powerful." As they walked together through the bustling conference center, Maria's phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, expecting more messages from colleagues or reporters, but the name on the screen stopped her in her tracks. It was Captain Wilkins. Maria exchanged a glance with David before answering the call. "Hello, Captain." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Wilkins spoke. "Ms. Alves, I wanted to personally inform you that the internal review of your case has been completed. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. We've also issued a formal apology, which has been sent to you in writing." Maria took a breath, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. "Thank you for the update, Captain," she said. "But this isn't just about an apology. This is about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." "I understand," Wilkins replied, his voice sincere. "We're taking this very seriously, and I assure you, changes will be made." Maria nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll be holding you to that, Captain." After ending the call, Maria slipped her phone back into her bag and looked at David, who had been listening quietly. "It's a start," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But there's still so much more to do." David nodded in agreement. "And you'll be the one leading the charge." "I'm sure of it." Maria smiled, though the road ahead was daunting. She knew that this fight would continue long after the conference was over. But she was ready. She had always been ready. After her keynote speech, Maria was approached by several attendees eager to speak with her. Colleagues, students, and even a few media representatives lined up, their faces a mix of admiration and curiosity. Maria welcomed each interaction, understanding that these conversations could further amplify her message. One young woman, in particular, stood out among the crowd. She introduced herself as Tasha, a law student from a local university. "Your speech was so inspiring," Tasha said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "I want to become a public defender and fight for justice like you." Maria smiled warmly. "That's wonderful to hear, Tasha. We need passionate advocates like you. Remember, every voice counts in this fight." As Tasha continued to express her admiration and share her own experiences with racial bias in the legal system, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was what she had fought for all along, to inspire the next generation of leaders and change-makers. After a flurry of conversations, Maria found a quiet moment to collect her thoughts. She stepped outside the conference center, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful backdrop to a day that had been anything but ordinary. But the sense of peace was short-lived. As she scrolled through her phone, she saw a notification that sent a chill down her spine, a news alert about the airport incident. The headline read, "Airport Security Under Fire. Judge Claims Racial Profiling." Maria's heart raced as she clicked on the article. It detailed her story, highlighting the humiliation she endured, and included statements from her colleagues and supporters who had rallied around her. As she read through the piece, her initial sense of triumph began to wane, replaced by an awareness of the storm that was brewing. Back inside the conference, Maria decided to address the situation head-on during the closing panel discussion. The room filled with attendees, eager to hear from experts about the future of justice in an increasingly polarized world. Maria took her seat on the panel, which included legal scholars, activists, and even a representative from the Justice Department. As the discussion flowed, the topic inevitably turned to issues of systemic racism within law enforcement. Maria seized the opportunity. "I'd like to share a personal experience," she said, her voice steady but passionate. "Just yesterday, I was wrongfully detained at the airport because of the color of my skin. This isn't just my story. It's the story of countless individuals who face similar experiences daily. The room fell silent as the audience absorbed her words. The other panelists looked on, some nodding in understanding, while others appeared visibly uncomfortable. The representative from the Justice Department, a stern-looking man named Mr. Jenkins, finally spoke up. While we must acknowledge the importance of addressing these issues, we must also recognize the efforts being made to reform law enforcement practices across the country. Maria met his gaze unwavering. And yet, we see these incidents happening time and time again. Reform is not enough if it doesn't address the root causes of systemic racism. We need accountability and transparency. The tension in the room thickened as the discussion continued, with Maria pushing back against complacency. She articulated the need for concrete actions and consequences, not just lip service. Her conviction resonated with the audience, and Maria could feel the collective energy shift, fueling her determination. After the panel concluded, attendees approached her with a renewed sense of urgency. Many expressed their appreciation for her candidness and offered their support in advocating for change. As the evening wore on, Maria found herself swept up in discussions about grassroots initiatives, community outreach programs, and ways to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve. But amidst the positive interactions, Maria also sensed the weight of responsibility settling upon her. She was no longer just a judge. She had become a symbol of resistance and resilience. The news coverage of her story had thrust her into the spotlight, and she knew that her actions moving forward would be scrutinized. As she walked back to her hotel that night, Maria couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She had spoken her truth, but now there was a palpable sense of pressure to live up to the expectations of those who looked to her for guidance. Back in her room, she opened her laptop and began drafting a statement for the press. It was important to clarify her message and reiterate her commitment to fighting systemic injustice. She wanted to ensure that her story was not just a headline, but a call to action. Hours passed as she crafted the statement, carefully choosing her words. She wanted to inspire others to join her in the fight, to turn outrage into action. Finally, satisfied with her work, she sent the statement to her team for review. The following day, Maria was scheduled to appear on a popular talk show to discuss her experience and the broader implications for society. She felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as she prepared for the interview. The stakes felt higher than ever, and she wanted to make sure her message resonated with a wider audience. As the day progressed, Maria began receiving messages from various organizations wanting to partner with her. Civil rights groups, legal associations, and community activists all expressed their desire to collaborate and amplify her voice. It was overwhelming, but also invigorating. She realized that this moment was bigger than her individual experience. It was an opportunity to bring about real change. However, she also knew that with great visibility came greater scrutiny. As she prepared for the talk show, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there would be those who would try to undermine her message, who would twist her words to fit their narrative. But Maria was determined not to let fear dictate her actions. When the time came for the interview, Maria took a deep breath, reminding herself of the purpose behind her appearance. She stepped onto the set, the bright lights glaring down on her as the host greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome, Judge Maria Alves," the host said. "We're so glad to have you here today to share your powerful story." Maria smiled back, feeling a surge of resolve. "Thank you for having me. It's an important conversation we need to have." As the interview began, Maria spoke openly and passionately, sharing her experiences and the need for systemic change. She articulated her vision for a more just society, urging viewers to recognize their roles in the fight against racism. Throughout the discussion, she maintained her focus, never wavering under the pressure. By the end, she felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. She had used her platform to speak truth to power, to inspire others to join the fight for justice. As the show wrapped up, Maria knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for equality and justice would require relentless effort, and she was ready to lead the charge. The ripple effect of her experience would continue to grow, impacting lives far beyond her own. The days following Maria's talk show appearance were a whirlwind. News outlets were buzzing with her story, and social media platforms exploded with discussions about racial justice, spurred by her powerful message. Maria received countless messages of support from people across the country, activists, students, and even strangers who had faced similar injustices. It felt surreal, yet deeply fulfilling. Maria found herself in a series of meetings with various organizations looking to collaborate. There was a renewed energy in the air, a sense that momentum was building toward meaningful change. As she met with community leaders and activists, she shared her vision for a grassroots initiative that would focus on education, advocacy, and creating safe spaces for dialogue. One afternoon, Maria met with a group of activists at a local community center. They gathered in a small room adorned with posters advocating for justice, equality, and solidarity. As they sat in a circle, Maria felt a sense of camaraderie and purpose. "Thank you all for coming," she began, looking around the room at the eager faces. "I know we all share a common goal: to dismantle systemic racism and create a more just society. I believe we can start by empowering our communities through education and advocacy." A young man named Jamal, who had been heavily involved in organizing local protests, spoke up. "I love the idea, but we need to make sure our message is clear. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and we need to counter it effectively." Maria nodded, appreciating his insight. "Absolutely, Jamal. We can work on creating educational materials and workshops that address these issues directly. We should also collaborate with local schools and universities to reach younger audiences." As the discussion progressed, the group brainstormed ideas for campaigns, workshops, and outreach programs. They planned to host community forums where residents could voice their concerns and experiences. The energy in the room was palpable, and Maria felt invigorated by the collective passion. In the weeks that followed, they launched their initiative, Voices for Justice, and it quickly gained traction. Community members began to show up for the forums, eager to share their stories and engage in conversations about race and justice. Maria led workshops that educated participants about their rights, the legal system, and the importance of civic engagement. One particular evening, during a community forum, Maria sat in front of a packed audience. The room buzzed with anticipation as individuals prepared to share their stories. A middle-aged woman named Linda stood up first, her voice shaking slightly. "I was stopped by police last year for a broken taillight," Linda began, her eyes welling with tears. "They treated me like a criminal, searched my car, and humiliated me in front of my children. I was just driving home from work. I can't shake that fear." Maria felt her heart ache for Linda. "Thank you for sharing your story, Linda," she said gently. "Your experience is a reminder of the injustices that still exist. It's important that we talk about these incidents and demand accountability." The audience erupted in support, clapping for Linda's courage. One by one, others began to share their experiences, and Maria facilitated the discussions, creating a safe space for healing and understanding. As the night went on, the atmosphere shifted from pain to empowerment. People began to connect, share resources, and build a network of support. Meanwhile, Maria's platform continued to grow. She was invited to speak at schools, universities, and even on national television. Each time she took the stage, she shared not just her story, but the collective stories of those who had faced injustice. Her voice became a powerful tool for advocacy, inspiring others to join the fight. However, Maria also faced backlash. Some individuals and groups pushed back against her message, questioning her credibility and labeling her a troublemaker. Social media became a battleground, with heated debates erupting over her statements and the initiative she championed. It was disheartening, but Maria remained undeterred. She understood that change often came with resistance. One evening, after a particularly intense day of media appearances and community meetings, Maria returned home feeling drained. She sank into her couch, staring blankly at the wall. As she scrolled through her phone, she stumbled upon a tweet from an unknown account attacking her credibility and questioning her motives. In that moment, frustration bubbled up within her. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but she knew that engaging in online battles would not further her cause. Instead, she took a deep breath, reminding herself of the purpose behind her work. She decided to channel her energy into something productive. The following day, she held a meeting with her team to discuss their upcoming projects and initiatives. "We need to keep our focus on the community," she said, determined. "Let's continue to empower others and create spaces for dialogue. We can't let negativity distract us from our mission." As they brainstormed new ideas, Maria felt a renewed sense of hope. She had seen firsthand the impact of their work, the way it brought people together and fostered understanding. The ripple effect of her actions was undeniable, and it fueled her commitment to the cause. As the months passed, Voices for Justice gained national recognition, drawing attention from prominent civil rights leaders and organizations. Maria was invited to collaborate on larger initiatives aimed at reforming police practices and addressing systemic racism at the legislative level. One day, Maria received an unexpected call from a member of Congress, expressing interest in her work and the possibility of drafting new legislation. "Your grassroots efforts are inspiring, Maria," the Congresswoman said. "We want to amplify your voice in Washington." Maria felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was a chance to make a significant impact, but it also came with challenges. She would need to navigate the political landscape and work alongside individuals with differing views. As she hung up the phone, Maria took a moment to reflect on her journey. From that fateful day at the airport to becoming a national advocate for justice, she had come a long way. The fight was far from over, but she was ready to tackle the challenges ahead. She was more than just a judge. She was a beacon of hope, leading the charge for change. With her determination set, Maria knew that together with her community, they could turn the tide against injustice. The rising tide of change was upon them, and she was prepared to ride the wave. The momentum for Voices for Justice was undeniable. With Maria at the helm, the initiative evolved into a powerful movement, gathering support from various sectors, community leaders, educators, and even some members of law enforcement who recognized the need for change. Maria felt a sense of purpose each time she stepped into a meeting or spoke at an event, her passion igniting a fire in those around her. As the movement gained traction, they began planning a large-scale rally in the city center, aiming to bring attention to the issues of systemic racism and police reform. The date was set, and Maria's team worked tirelessly to spread the word. They reached out to local organizations, schools, and activist groups, encouraging everyone to participate. The day of the rally arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Thousands gathered, holding signs that proclaimed messages of hope and unity. Maria stood on the steps of City Hall, her heart swelling with pride as she looked out at the diverse crowd. Families, students, seniors, and activists all united for a common cause. As she took the microphone, the cheers and applause enveloped her. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "This is not just a rally. It's a movement. Together, we are standing up against injustice and demanding accountability." The crowd erupted in applause, and Maria felt a surge of energy course through her. She spoke passionately about the importance of community engagement, education, and advocacy. She emphasized that change could only happen when everyone played their part. As Maria shared her personal journey, recounting the incidents of racial profiling she faced and the systemic issues that persisted, she noticed individuals in the audience nodding in recognition. Their faces reflected the shared pain and frustration that many felt. "Each of you has a story to tell," Maria continued. And by sharing those stories, we are breaking down the barriers of silence that have allowed injustice to flourish. Our voices matter, and together we can create a future where everyone feels safe and respected. As she finished her speech, the crowd erupted into cheers, chants of justice for all, echoing through the streets. In that moment, Maria knew that this was more than just a rally. It was a turning point. The energy was palpable, and she could feel the winds of change beginning to shift. In the following weeks, the rally garnered national attention, with media coverage highlighting the community's demands for reform. Maria received invitations to speak at conferences and forums across the country, and her message resonated with many. The push for accountability and transparency gained momentum, leading to discussions about policy changes at local and state levels. However, Maria also faced challenges. Critics continued to attack her online, dismissing her message and questioning her motives. There were moments when the weight of the backlash felt overwhelming, but Maria found solace in the community she had built. She leaned on her supporters and allies, reminding herself that every movement faced resistance. One evening, as she prepared for another public speaking engagement, Maria reflected on how far she had come. She thought about the days she had been wrongfully detained and how that incident had sparked a fire within her. It was a painful memory, but it had led her to a purpose greater than herself. During her travels, Maria met individuals whose lives had been profoundly impacted by her message. She received heartfelt letters from people who shared how her story had encouraged them to speak out, get involved, and advocate for change. It was a reminder that her voice had power. As she stood before another audience, she took a moment to express her gratitude. "Thank you for believing in this movement," she said, her voice strong yet vulnerable. "Together, we are planting seeds of change. And while we may not see the fruits of our labor immediately, I promise you that our efforts will not be in vain." As Maria continued her journey, she began to explore opportunities to expand the reach of Voices for Justice. She envisioned educational programs for schools and partnerships with organizations dedicated to supporting marginalized communities. In her heart, she knew that change would take time, but she was committed to seeing it through. With each passing day, she felt a deepening sense of responsibility, not just for herself, but for those who had come before her and those who would come after. Years later, as Maria looked back on her journey, she realized the ripple effects of her work were far-reaching. The movement had inspired new generations of advocates, and the conversations about race and justice had become a staple in schools and community centers. Maria decided to document her experiences in a book, sharing the lessons she had learned and the stories that had shaped her journey. She wanted to ensure that future generations understood the importance of resilience and the power of collective action. On the day of her book launch, Maria stood before a crowd of eager readers, her heart full. "This book is not just my story," she began, her voice resonating with emotion. "It is the story of all of us, the struggles, the victories, and the hope for a brighter future. Together, we can continue to challenge the status quo and work toward justice for everyone." As she signed copies and engaged with her readers, Maria felt a sense of fulfillment. The legacy she was building was not just her own. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside her in the battle for justice. And as she looked out at the diverse faces in the crowd, she knew that the journey was far from over. With every step, they were inching closer to a world where justice and equality prevailed. Maria was more than a judge. She was a beacon of hope, and her light would continue to shine brightly for all who sought change.